Do you feel, in that heavy silence that accompanies your soul, a fire that insists on burning? A fire that not only burns, but destroys everything you think you know about yourself? You're trapped in an invisible cycle, a seemingly endless cycle, and perhaps, deep down, you wonder, why does this flame consume me without ever dying? Why does addiction hold me captive, dominate me, and even when I try to escape, it returns, stronger, more urgent? It's not a cruel coincidence or a punishment. Carl Jung, the great explorer of the human soul, teaches us that addiction is not the enemy you imagine. It's not here to ruin your life, even though that may seem true, but to deliver a powerful and urgent message from the depths of your unconscious. It's a cry, a signal of something your conscious mind hasn't yet dared to confront. The psyche is not a failing machine. It is a living, dynamic system that responds to deep wounds and internal conflicts. Addiction, whether to alcohol, drugs, sex, power, or even perfection, is not simply a foolish choice or a moral weakness. It is an attempt, often unconscious and desperate, to heal a wound in the soul, to fill an existential void, to seek a lost wholeness. This blind pursuit isn't a lack of strength, but an urgent call for wholeness. Jung shows us that addiction is an expression of the shadow, that part of us that has been rejected, repressed, hidden to survive the world, but that never disappears. It speaks through our behaviors, dreams, pain, and addictions. When you turn to drinking, compulsion, and control, you're not just escaping suffering. You're being pulled by an ancient energy, an ancestral wound that needs to be seen and understood. It's not the substance itself that sustains the addiction, it's the feeling it provides. Alcohol, for example, is not desired for what it contains, but for the momentary oblivion it offers. It's the silence of guilt, the pause from self-criticism, the relief from the unbearable weight of being oneself. This reveals the hidden truth. The behavior is the surface of a much more sacred and profound problem, a call from within that cries out for recognition. Every addiction is an unconscious initiation, a flawed path of transformation, devoid of meaning and ritual, which seeks to dissolve the suffering of the ego in an illusion of transcendence. This is why combating addiction by simply withdrawing the substance is insufficient. This false ritual must be replaced with a true rite of passage, a conscious dive into one's own shadow to find what was lost. Healing doesn't lie in running away from what hurts, but in dialoguing with one's own shadow, embracing it as an essential part of the whole. Addiction isn't the end of the story, but the beginning of a profound journey toward individuation, the process by which a human being becomes whole, bringing together all their parts, light and darkness, strength and vulnerability. So when someone says they can't stop, it's not a lack of willpower. It's a cry from the soul saying, "What power does this compulsion offer me? What part of me finds safety only in this oblivion?" We need to recognize addiction as a map that points to the wound, an untold story crying out to be heard. The unconscious, vast and archetypal, manifests itself through ancient symbols and myths, narrating the drama of exile and return, fall and resurrection. Addiction is one of these dramas, a mystical search for what was lost. In ancient cultures, this journey was accompanied by guides, rituals, and witnesses. Today, the individual is often left alone with their pain, ignored, or judged. But true healing begins when you become your own guide, when you accept the opportunity to delve into the realm of dreams, where the unconscious reveals itself in symbols and images that the conscious mind cannot avoid. In these symbols lies the key to deciphering the meaning of addiction and, thus, transcending its prison. Don't just ask how to stop. Ask what your addiction is trying to protect. What child inside you still cries? What part of you is hungry for love, for a voice, for acceptance? Only by answering these questions does the true journey of healing begin, which is not fighting, but listening, not denial, but integration. To cross the fire of addiction is to face the abyss, to look at one's own shadow and embrace it as a teacher, not an enemy. It's to recognize that compulsion is not your end, but an invitation to the rebirth of yourself, that luminous center that transcends the ego and brings true freedom. You are not broken. You are transforming. Addiction is not your end, but the dark womb that shelters the beginning of a new life. Now, take a deep breath and prepare to continue this journey, because what comes next may forever change the way you see yourself, how you understand your pain, and how you begin to break free. There is a moment, often silent, almost imperceptible, when the soul begins to awaken to the truth that has been hidden behind the compulsion. This moment is like a ray of light that opens in the darkness, revealing that addiction is not an enemy to be defeated by willpower alone, but a symbolic path that invites a profound encounter with oneself. Throughout your life, you may have heard simplistic advice that says, "Stop now, control yourself, be strong." But these words don't get to the root of what's at stake. True strength isn't found in suppressing pain or denying suffering. It's found in the courage to look within, to confront what addiction tries to hide, a part of you that has been abandoned, rejected, forgotten, your own helplessness. Jung teaches us that the unconscious speaks in symbols, in dreams, in metaphors that we often don't understand at first glance. Addiction, in this sense, is a language, a symbol of the soul's cry for integration. By understanding this, you stop being a victim of your own compulsions and begin to be a careful observer, an interlocutor of your own shadow. It's as if two forces exist within you: the ego, which wants to maintain control at all costs, and the unconscious, which presses to be recognized, to emerge with all its depth. Compulsion is the battlefield where these forces clash, but it's also the place where reconciliation can begin. When you learn to listen to what addiction is trying to tell you, you realize it points to an unhealed wound, a deep loneliness, a search for meaning that has never been satisfied. Addiction is the desperate cry of something crying out for care, for love, for acceptance. This conscious listening requires you to move from a position of self-fighting to a position of dialogue and acceptance. It's an invitation to develop a compassionate relationship with your own shadows, to recognize the part of you that suffers and tries to protect itself in the only way it knows how. You can begin this listening through mindfulness, observing without judgment the sensations, thoughts, and emotions that accompany the compulsion. Not to blame yourself, but to understand. This simple yet powerful practice creates an opening for the unconscious to begin expressing itself more clearly, allowing you to identify the roots of suffering. Furthermore, it's crucial to seek support, not just medical or psychological, but also spiritual and symbolic. Jung emphasized that in ancient cultures, psychic crises were accompanied by rituals that gave meaning to pain, transforming suffering into passage, despair into rebirth. Today, although the external rituals may have been lost, the internal ritual, the symbolic delve into one's own shadow, remains accessible. Through art, writing, contact with nature, and meditation, you can construct your own rite of passage, a sacred process that replaces the emptiness of addiction with a full, conscious presence. And if you feel this path is challenging, know that you are not alone. Here, together, we are building a space for listening, learning, and transformation. Subscribe to this channel to join me on this profound journey of self-knowledge and healing. Each new video is an invitation to delve deeper, to understand your soul's messages, and to cultivate the strength that comes from truly connecting with yourself. Remember, the strength you seek lies not in denying your addiction, but in accepting what it reveals, the shadow that cries out for integration, the cry of your being that longs to be heard. This is the door to true freedom, and it opens when you decide to listen to, understand, and love yourself in all your complexity. Stay alert to this inner voice, for it is the beacon that lights your path back to wholeness. Don't fear what arises, even if it seems painful. It is precisely in this confrontation that healing occurs. You are taking the first steps toward transforming your suffering into wisdom, your pain into power. Join this journey with an open heart, for the path ahead is arduous, but also deeply liberating. With each step, you move closer to your true self, the one who is whole, authentic, and immeasurable in its strength. At its core, what sustains addiction is a profound internal division, a split between the conscious ego, which seeks control and order, and the unconscious, which burns with unrecognized desires and wounds. This division creates a void that addiction attempts to fill, albeit illusorily and temporarily. Jung warns us that as long as this conflict remains unintegrated, the cycle of compulsion will continue, like a dance between flight and return, loss and relentless pursuit. It's crucial to understand that compulsion doesn't arise out of nowhere. It stems from an ancient sense of helplessness, a psychological abandonment that manifests as a silent scream. This abandonment can be rooted in childhood experiences, in traumas that shaped a fragile ego and a shadow filled with pain and rejection. Addiction, then, is a way of surviving inner loneliness, a desperate mechanism to silence the internal noise that has become unbearable. Jung emphasized that the unconscious is not only personal, but collective and archetypal, laden with ancestral symbols and myths that shape our lives without our realizing it. Addiction can be seen as a mythical enactment, a passage through the dark night of the soul, where the individual is called to confront their own inner demons. However, without guidance or conscious ritual, this passage becomes a trap, a descent into the repetition of suffering. What addiction truly seeks is a form of initiation, a transformation that can break the alienation of the fragmented self. This initiation, when experienced consciously, involves diving into one's own shadow, an encounter with the rejected parts of oneself that cry out for recognition and love. It is a painful and demanding process, because it demands courage to look at what the ego would prefer to hide. Contrary to what society often thinks, recovery is not simply a matter of willpower or external control. It is an internal journey, an alchemical process of integrating what has been divided, of transforming poison into medicine. Addiction, then, is a harsh teacher that shows us where we are wounded and what we need to heal to become whole. This integration requires a deep and compassionate attitude of listening to oneself. We must stop fighting our own shadows and start dialoguing with them, recognizing their value as essential parts of our being. Each compulsive impulse, each relapse, can be seen as a symbolic message, a mirror that reveals what is still hidden, what still needs to be embraced. The process of individuation, so dear to Jung, does not eliminate suffering, but transforms it into meaning. It invites us to go beyond simple abstinence and seek an authentic encounter with the totality of our being. This means accepting imperfections, embracing contradictions, and embracing vulnerability without judgment. In practice, this means developing internal tools that allow us to live with pain without having to escape it, that help us recognize triggers without automatically succumbing to them. Techniques such as mindfulness, dream analysis, creative expression, and therapy are paths that foster this reconciliation between the conscious and unconscious. It's also essential to create a support network that respects this complexity, that doesn't judge or simplify suffering, but rather offers space for the healing process to unfold in its own time. Isolation and shame only fuel the cycle of compulsion, while connection and acceptance offer a real chance for transformation. As the individual progresses along this path, they begin to realize that the identity constructed around addiction, the self that needs the substance, the behavior, the escape, is a mask that limits their true essence. Freeing oneself from addiction is, therefore, an opportunity to rediscover the authentic self, the one that doesn't depend on escapism to exist. This reunion is not an endpoint, but a new beginning, an invitation to live with greater depth, presence, and integrity. It is the possibility of transforming suffering into wisdom, pain into growth, loss into rebirth. And it is a path that requires patience, perseverance, and, above all, love for oneself, for one's humanity, and for one's infinite capacity for reinvention. Thus, addiction ceases to be a sentence and becomes a passage. Painful, yes, but also full of potential. A call for the individual to become the alchemist of their own life, capable of transmuting the lead of compulsion into the gold of consciousness, and finally walking toward true freedom, the freedom to be whole, imperfect, and deeply alive. The process of healing and transformation that addiction invites is, above all, a profound encounter with one's own vulnerability, that part of ourselves that we often prefer to hide or deny. Jung reminds us that true strength comes from recognizing and accepting what makes us human: pain, fear, imperfection. Only by embracing these dark parts with compassion can we begin true integration and dissolve the compulsive cycle that imprisons the soul. It's important to understand that the shadow, this hidden part of the psyche that carries repressed fears and desires, doesn't disappear when we try to ignore or control it. On the contrary, it gains strength, becomes more urgent, until we are forced to acknowledge it. Addiction is one of the clearest and most dramatic forms of this call. It's not the villain in your story, but the messenger bringing a truth you may not yet have the courage to hear. When addiction returns, when the urge seems uncontrollable, don't treat yourself as an enemy. Instead, see this compulsion as a sign, a mirror that reflects what you haven't yet integrated into your being. Ask yourself, what part of me is crying out for attention? What pain is hidden behind this impulse? What shadow needs to be illuminated so I can truly free myself? This approach transforms the relationship with addiction. Fighting is replaced by dialogue. Judgment is replaced by deep listening. Solitary struggle is replaced by the possibility of reconciliation, which, though painful, is liberating. Jung reminds us that healing is not a linear or easy path, but a constant movement of encounter, failure, learning, and rebirth. This journey doesn't have to be lonely. Building a support network that embraces your complexity, that acknowledges your pain without reducing your experience to cliches, is essential. The acceptance, understanding, and empathy of others are pillars that strengthen the courage to face one's own shadows and stay on the path of transformation. Along this journey, developing practices that promote conscious presence is essential. Techniques such as meditation, dream analysis, contact with nature, therapeutic writing, and other forms of creative expression help strengthen the connection with the deep self. They offer tools for observing patterns without blindly identifying with them, for embracing pain without drowning in it. And as we journey through this process, a new perspective begins to emerge, one that doesn't see addiction as an enemy, but as an opportunity to awaken it. Compulsion ceases to be the center of identity and becomes a gateway, a portal that leads to self-knowledge and liberation. If you feel that this message touches your soul, that it resonates with your experience and awakens the desire to walk towards healing, I invite you to like this video. Your gesture is more than a simple click. It is an acknowledgement of your own journey, a step toward acceptance and growth. Liking is also an act of connection, as it strengthens the community that seeks to understand the complexity of addiction as a phenomenon of the soul, not just behavior. It's an invitation for more people to find this space for deep reflection, where suffering can be transformed into wisdom. With each like, you help expand this invisible support network, made up of awakened souls who recognize that healing is both a collective and individual journey. And when you allow yourself to courageously embrace your vulnerability, you become a living example that it is possible to transform what felt like a prison into freedom. Remember, true transformation begins the moment you change your relationship with your own shadow, when you decide to look within with compassionate, fearless eyes. It's a simple yet immense step, the step that opens the door to reconciliation with yourself. So, allow yourself this encounter. Know that the journey is challenging, but full of meaning. That each day, even in the face of setbacks and difficulties, you can grow stronger, integrating the fragmented parts and moving toward wholeness. It is in this conscious surrender that addiction loses its power and the soul begins to blossom. And it is this same surrender that makes you, watching now, an example of courage and transformation. Your journey matters, your pain is sacred, and your awakening is a gift not only for you, but for all who cross your path. So, stay alert, stay strong, and know that this space is a continuous invitation for you to find yourself, love yourself, and free yourself. The path is yours, but it doesn't have to be lonely. We are together in this profound search for freedom of the soul. Encountering our own shadow, this dark and forgotten territory of our being, is the key to true transformation. Jung teaches us that the shadow is not an enemy to be eliminated, but an indispensable part of our wholeness, the side of the psyche that contains everything we reject, deny, or fear within ourselves. In addiction, this shadow manifests intensely and often chaotically, as it is where the fears, wounds, and unmet needs that fuel the compulsive cycle reside. Recognizing the shadow is no easy task. It's an invitation to brutal honesty with oneself, to look without masks at what we'd rather hide. It's allowing repressed emotions to surface, hidden desires to be brought to light, buried pain to finally be felt. This process can seem daunting, as it touches the core of our vulnerability, the space where the fear of being rejected, inadequate, or simply too human resides. Yet it is precisely this confrontation that makes integration possible, the fusion of the conscious with the unconscious, of the ego with the self. Addiction often arises as a desperate attempt to maintain this division, an effort to escape the shadow that bothers, that incompleteness, that cries for attention. But this escape is illusory and, in the long run, destructive. The true path to freedom lies in the courage to look within, to embrace each fragment of the shadow with compassion and curiosity. By doing this, you begin to demystify addiction. It stops being an enemy to be feared and becomes a messenger, a teacher who reveals where your soul is wounded and what needs healing. This shift in perspective is crucial to the healing process, as it transforms addiction from a curse into an opportunity for profound growth. This journey of integration is also a process of self-compassion. Jung emphasized that the shadow should not be judged, but understood. When you allow the rejected parts of yourself to be seen with love, you create an internal space where healing can occur. It's not about apologizing for your own flaws, but about accepting that they are part of the complexity of being human, and that within this complexity lies the possibility of transformation. It's important to remember that this integration doesn't eliminate pain immediately, nor does it promise rapid or linear change. The shadow is resilient, defending itself to survive, and can manifest itself through relapses, internal resistance, and moments of despair. However, each step toward awareness strengthens the ability to embrace these manifestations without losing oneself in them. In the therapeutic process, for example, Working with the shadow is essential to deconstruct automatic patterns that lead to addiction. Analyzing dreams, exploring fantasies, and expressing repressed emotions are paths that help reveal what is hidden and give voice to what has been silenced. It's a process of deep listening that requires patience, courage, and, above all, self-love. Jung also reminds us of the importance of symbols in this process. The psyche speaks in images and metaphors, and understanding these symbols is fundamental to accessing the hidden meaning of addiction. Through them, the unconscious guides us on the path to healing, showing that each compulsion carries within it a message, a request, a calling. Therefore, true transformation happens when you begin to dialogue with these symbols, when you learn to listen to what the addiction wants to teach, not just what it wants to hide. This conscious listening opens space for the self to manifest with all its strength and wisdom, offering a new, broader, and more integrated identity. This new identity isn't perfect. There's no such thing as perfection in a human soul, but it's authentic, profound, and capable of handling life's challenges with greater balance. It's an identity that embraces its own shadow without fear, that understands that suffering is part of the growth process, and that finds meaning even in the most difficult pain. Thus, addiction ceases to be a repetitive cycle of pain and becomes a passage toward wholeness. The shadow becomes familiar territory, no longer a hidden enemy. And it is in this territory that you find the seeds of your healing, the keys to your freedom, and the paths to becoming who you truly are. Recognizing this truth is not only an act of courage, but a commitment to life, the life that pulses within you, ready to manifest itself in its fullness, integrity, and light. This is the promise Jung leaves us. The journey through addiction can be a sacred path, a rite of passage toward the rebirth of the self. And to walk this journey, you simply need to be willing to encounter yourself, in all your complexity, with love and truth. Reaching the point of confronting one's own shadow is, for many, a moment of profound despair and revelation. Jung knew that it is not merely a fleeting or superficial glimpse, but a true dive into the darkest depths of the self, what he called a descent into personal hell. In this space of silence and darkness, the soul comes face to face with its oldest wounds, its unhealed pains, its buried traumas. It is a journey that demands courage and can seem terrifying, for it requires relinquishing comforting illusions and confronting what has been denied for so long. However, this descent is not a path without light. On the contrary, it is precisely in this abyss that the possibility of rebirth begins to emerge. Jung argued that, by facing the inner hell, the individual has the chance to emerge transformed, more whole, more authentic. Addiction, which seemed like an impenetrable prison, then reveals itself as a portal, an invitation for the soul to transcend suffering and find a new way of being. During this journey, the ego, with its need for control and security, finds itself challenged. It resists, as the shadow brings to the surface aspects it would rather hide. Fears, anger, repressed desires, old guilt. This resistance is natural, as the ego fears losing its central position, fears the chaos that seems to come with the disintegration of the identity built over a lifetime. But Jung teaches us that true individuation, the process of becoming a complete being, only happens when the ego accepts giving way to the self, this totality that integrates light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, to manifest. It's a delicate dance between losing and gaining, between dying to the old and being reborn into the new. In this movement, the shadow ceases to be seen as an enemy and begins to be recognized as a vital aspect of the self, a guardian of inner truth. By integrating the shadow, you begin to dissolve the energy of addiction, because the compulsive impulse loses its power when its roots are brought to the light of consciousness. This integration is a slow and often painful process, as it involves confronting uncomfortable truths. It can reveal family patterns, limiting beliefs, and wounds that span generations. Jung emphasizes the importance of support on this journey. It is not a solitary journey, but a path strengthened by the compassionate presence of others and the assistance of therapeutic practices that help translate the messages of the unconscious. Furthermore, connecting with symbolism and personal myths is a powerful tool. The unconscious communicates through images, dreams, myths, and archetypes, and learning to decipher this symbolic language opens doors to healing. Through symbols, the shadow reveals its intentions and offers pathways to inner reconciliation. The process of individuation also invites us to recognize that suffering is not something to simply be eliminated, but a necessary aspect of growth. Jung said that only those who have faced their own darkness can know true light. Addiction, with all its pain, is a harsh teacher that teaches this lesson with severity, but also with love, as it seeks to lead the individual beyond the limitations of the fragmented ego. Thus, healing from addiction is not an act of suppression or control, but a movement of conscious surrender to the process of soul transformation. It is an invitation to abandon the illusion that external control can resolve internal conflict, and to embrace the complexity of one's own psyche with humility and patience. By allowing yourself this surrender, you discover a new strength, a wisdom born of honest self-examination. This strength is not the absence of pain, but the ability to walk with it, to remain present even when everything seems to be falling apart. On this path, compulsion loses its power because you no longer face it with anger or guilt, but with understanding and acceptance. You learn to differentiate what is yours from what belongs to the unintegrated shadow, and you begin to restore the inner harmony that addiction tried to obscure. It's a process of rebuilding the self, where each integrated piece of the shadow expands your capacity to love, to connect, to live authentically. Jung said that the self is the center of the total personality, the archetype of totality, and it is in it that we find true freedom. To go through this journey is to become an alchemist of one's own life, transforming the lead of suffering into the gold of wisdom. And although the road is long and full of challenges, it is, at the same time, the path to the deepest fulfillment, reconciliation with oneself and the discovery of the hidden meaning in suffering. Therefore, continuing to descend, to listen, to integrate, is the only true way to free oneself from the prison of addiction. Because true healing is not outside, but within. In the sacred dialogue between the ego and the shadow, in the loving embrace of the whole soul. On the path of transformation, one of the greatest challenges is learning to embrace the emotions that emerge from contact with the shadow, those intense sensations that make us tremble, paralyze us, and invite us to flee. Jung knew that the healing process is not about eliminating these emotions, but about allowing them to be felt and understood, without fear or judgment. It is in this space of acceptance that true integration begins to blossom. When we face addiction, this task becomes even more urgent. Repressed emotions, anger, sadness, fear, loneliness, often find an outlet in compulsive behavior. Addiction offers momentary relief, an anesthesia that promises to silence the pain but actually perpetuates the cycle of suffering. To break this cycle, it is necessary, first and foremost, to genuinely reconnect with these emotions, a willingness to feel them fully. This experience can be deeply uncomfortable, as these emotions often carry old memories, pains that were buried so we could survive. Jung reminds us that the psyche is wise and that these emotions, however difficult they may be, play a vital role in our journey of individuation. They are signs of what needs healing, drawing our attention to aspects that have been marginalized from consciousness. Accepting this emotional dimension is a powerful way to reclaim the power addiction seemed to have over us. When we stop running, when we allow ourselves to feel without drowning, we begin to dissolve our identification with compulsive behavior. This internal shift opens space for new responses, for conscious choices that previously seemed impossible. Jung also emphasized the role of relationships in this process. It's not just a solitary encounter with oneself, but a dance between self and other. Genuine support from people who welcome us without judgment is essential for us to explore these deep emotions safely. Shared vulnerability creates fertile ground for healing, where the fear of loneliness transforms into strength to face one's own shadow. In this context, creating a space for your voice to be heard is an essential step. Reflecting and sharing what you feel, even if only in a few words, is an act of courage and self-affirmation. Jung believed that naming pain is the first step to dissipating it, because what is brought to light loses its power to dominate the soul in the shadows. If you're touched by this reflection, I invite you to leave a comment, sharing what sparked in you after hearing these words. It doesn't matter if the experience is still fresh or if you've been struggling with this process for a long time. Your voice is important and can be a beacon for others also walking in darkness. Writing about your experiences is a powerful symbolic act. By giving form to your emotions, you begin to build a bridge between the unconscious and the conscious, between inner chaos and the order that arises from self-knowledge. This bridge is the foundation for true transformation, one that is not superficial, but deep and lasting. Remember that the path is not linear and that setbacks are part of the process, not signs of failure. Each time you rise up, each time you face your shadow with honesty, you are strengthening your capacity for healing. Jung reminds us that the self, this sacred wholeness, does not reject imperfection, but embraces it as part of what makes us human. So, continue to look within with patience and compassion. Allow your emotions to be the fuel for change, not an obstacle to be feared. Recognize the power that exists in allowing yourself to feel, in opening yourself to the complexity of your own being. By sharing your journey, you not only help yourself, but also help others find the courage to face their own shadows. This invisible support network is one of the most powerful forces we can build in the pursuit of inner freedom. Know that your path matters, that your voice has value, and that transformation is possible. Even when the pain seems unbearable, there is a thread of hope that remains firm, the hope that comes from true connection with yourself. May these words be an invitation for you to delve even deeper into this encounter with yourself, so that you may find strength in vulnerability and discover the power that resides in embracing your own humanity. Feel free to express, reflect, and connect in the comments below. Your story is part of this larger movement of healing and liberation, and your voice could be the light someone needs to hear right now. Reaching this point in the journey, where the shadow is accepted and emotions begin to be experienced honestly, opens a new horizon, the awakening to the hidden meaning behind the compulsion. Jung teaches us that addiction, although painful and destructive, carries within it profound symbolism. It is a sign that something essential within our being is out of balance, an urgent call for inner reconciliation. Understanding this symbolic dimension is fundamental for lasting and true transformation. By viewing addiction as a language of the unconscious, we realize that it is not a mistake, a defect, or simply a moral failing. It is an archetypal narrative that expresses the struggle between conflicting internal forces, the ego seeking control and security, and the unconscious pulsating with desires, fears, and untapped potential. This narrative can be seen as a personal myth, a story the soul tells itself in search of meaning. Jung emphasized that symbols are the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, offering clues to resolving internal conflicts. Addiction, in this sense, can be interpreted as a symbol of separation, a division within the self that needs healing. It manifests the disconnect between the various parts of the psyche, a silent cry of a fragmented self crying out for unity. When you begin to decode this symbolic language, you open up the possibility of responding to addiction not with repression or denial, but with understanding and integration. This transforms the experience of suffering into a meaningful process, where each crisis becomes a portal to growth. For example, dreams and fantasies that accompany addiction often carry powerful imagery: wild animals, deep waters, labyrinths, stalking shadows. These symbols reveal aspects of the psyche that the conscious ego fails to recognize. Analyzing these symbols with attention and curiosity can reveal the hidden fears, ancestral wounds, and unrealized potential that fuel the compulsive cycle. This symbolic work is not a mere intellectual exercise. It is a living dialogue with the soul, where the language of images becomes a path to healing. Jung said that, without symbols, the soul dies. And it is precisely through these symbols that the shadow becomes known, understood, and integrated. As you delve deeper into this dialogue, you begin to realize that addiction, though it may seem like a barrier, is also a doorway. A doorway that, when crossed consciously, leads to a broader dimension of being, where unity and wholeness are possible. This process, however, requires you to become a true explorer of your own psyche, willing to confront not only pain but also hidden treasures. For within the shadow lies not only suffering, there is also an inexhaustible source of vitality, creativity, and wisdom. Integrating this inner richness means expanding the concept of healing beyond the simple elimination of symptoms. Healing is reconciliation, acceptance, and the harmonious encounter between internal polarities. It's learning to dance with the shadows, to walk with the lights, to be whole in all our complexity. This reconciliation brings with it a new way of being in the world. You begin to respond to challenges not with reactivity or avoidance, but with presence and discernment. Old compulsions lose their power because you no longer live in ignorance of your own shadow, but in the wisdom that arises from deep self-knowledge. And it is in this new place that true freedom begins to reveal itself, not a superficial or temporary freedom, but a freedom born of acceptance, integration, and self-love. A freedom that allows us to live authentically, even in the face of human imperfections and limitations. Therefore, the journey through addiction is also a journey through the symbolism of the soul, an invitation to become aware of the myth that dwells within you. It's a chance to reclaim the power that was lost in fragmentation and to rebuild a personal narrative that honors the wholeness of your being. In this inner space, where shadow and light coexist, compulsion is no longer a tyrant, but a signpost pointing the way to healing. And by following this path, you not only free yourself from addiction but also awaken to the fullness of life, to the mystery and beauty of existence itself. This is the invitation Jung leaves us, to look at addiction not as an end, but as a beginning, not as a sentence, but as an opportunity, not as a defeat, but as an initiation into the rebirth of the self. When the journey through the soul reaches the point where the shadow is recognized and inner symbols begin to reveal their secrets, a profound transformation begins, the transformation of the self. Jung invites us to understand that the self is not a superficial construct, but the center of psychic wholeness, the essence that integrates light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, past and future. It is the self that guides the process of individuation, that sacred path that leads us to become who we truly are. At this stage of the journey, perception shifts. Addiction ceases to be the master of life and becomes a phenomenon within the vast internal landscape. You realize that you are not defined by your compulsions, that there is a part of you that remains whole, that observes and understands. This part is the self, a silent and constant presence that weathers internal storms and provides a center of stability. Integrating the self means embracing not only pain, but also forces that once seemed contradictory, strength and vulnerability, light and darkness, chaos and order. Jung reminds us that the self is the union of opposites, the synthesis that transcends duality. When this synthesis occurs, addiction loses its primary function, as it is no longer necessary as a survival or escape mechanism. This integration also brings a shift in how you relate to the world. Compulsion, once a desperate cry for meaning, now finds other ways to express itself, through creativity, love, and authenticity. The energy previously channeled into compulsive behavior is redirected toward living a full life, toward expressing the self in its truest form. This process, however, doesn't completely eliminate the challenge. The unconscious remains dynamic and sometimes brings up old patterns to be revisited and transformed. Individuation is an ongoing journey, a perpetual movement of growth and deepening. But with an integrated self, you have a secure anchor, a reference point that allows you to navigate turbulence with greater clarity and serenity. Jung emphasized that this presence of the self is a profoundly spiritual experience, though not necessarily tied to religious dogma. It is an encounter with a numinous dimension of the psyche, a connection with something greater that transcends the ego and time. It is in this encounter that true healing occurs, for the self has the power to harmonize the fragmented parts of the being and reveal the deepest meaning of suffering. Furthermore, recognizing and experiencing the presence of the self implies taking responsibility for one's own life. It's not about striving for perfection, but about cultivating honesty and authenticity, about opening oneself to what is real and alive within oneself. This responsibility is not a burden, but an expression of self-love and respect for one's own journey. In practice, this transformation can manifest itself in daily choices, small actions that reflect connection with the self, a moment of silence, a conscious decision, an act of kindness toward oneself and others. These choices build a life that is, little by little, increasingly aligned with one's inner truth. Awakening to the self also brings a profound sense of belonging, not just to a group or community, but to the flow of life itself. You begin to realize that you are part of a greater whole, that your story is a thread in the cosmic web, and that your path, with all its difficulties and victories, contributes to the universal meaning. This realization broadens the horizons of healing, as addiction ceases to be an isolated problem and becomes part of a larger process of personal and spiritual evolution. Understanding this brings relief and hope that sustain even the most difficult times. Jung said that individuation is the path to self-realization and that this process is the true task of life. By integrating addiction within this perspective, you become the protagonist of a story of redemption, where pain is not the end, but the means to a fuller rebirth. This rebirth doesn't erase the past, but transforms it into a foundation for the future. It's a reconciliation with everything that's been experienced, a loving embrace of one's own history, with its shadows and its lights. And it's from this place that you can walk authentically, knowing that you are, in essence, whole and sacred. Thus, addiction ceases to be a prison and becomes a passage. Hard, yes, but also necessary, to the flourishing of the self. The cycle of suffering is broken, and a new narrative begins. The narrative of someone who has faced their inner demons and, in doing so, discovered the strength and wisdom that have always been within them. This is the promise Jung makes to us, the promise that even in the depths of the struggle with addiction, there is a light waiting to be discovered, a self waiting to be lived, a life waiting to be fully lived. Getting here means much more than just understanding addiction. It means you've begun the sacred path of profound transformation, the path back to your true self, the one that exists beyond the shadows, beyond the compulsions, beyond the masks the ego erects to protect itself. Jung invites us to recognize that this journey is the most courageous of acts, for it requires you to become a climber of the soul, facing abysses and internal storms, but also marveling at the landscapes that emerge along the path of self-knowledge. Now, with this new perspective, you understand that addiction is not an enemy to be fought with brute force or guilt, but a part of you that needs to be embraced, understood, and integrated. You become one who dialogues with your own shadows, one who can fearlessly hear the cries of the unconscious, who can embrace what has been rejected and, thus, free yourself. This process is more than intellectual learning. It is a transformation of the entire being, an inner alchemy that transcends suffering and reveals the depth of life in all its complexity and beauty. You begin to inhabit a space where pain does not define, where the past does not imprison, and where the future is an open field for conscious creation. Throughout this journey, you discovered that true freedom arises from radical acceptance and love for yourself, even with imperfections, flaws, and moments of weakness. Jung reminds us that you are not what happened to you, you are what you choose to become. And this choice, made moment by moment, is what builds a life of integrity and authenticity. If you've made it this far, know that you're part of a larger movement, an invisible community of seekers who refuse to be defined by their addictions or shadows, who rise even when they fall, who choose the light even when darkness seems closest. This is cause for celebration. You are a living example of courage and transformation. Therefore, I invite you to continue this journey with us, to strengthen this network of support and reflection. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future reflections that will bring even more depth and tools to your journey. Enjoy this video as a gesture of affirmation, an acknowledgement of your struggle, your progress, and the importance of sharing this message with others who also need to hear it. And, most importantly, leave your comment. Share what this journey has meant to you, the discoveries you've made, the challenges you still face. Your voice could be the light another viewer needs to take the next step. Here, every story is valuable, every experience is respected, and every word has the power to build invisible bridges between souls seeking healing. Remember, you are not alone. Transformation is both a collective and intimate process, and your commitment to yourself inspires not only your own life but also the lives of those around you. This is the privilege of those who choose to look within, of those who accept the challenge of becoming whole. You are not a victim of circumstances, nor a hostage to the past. You are a warrior of the soul, an alchemist who has transmuted pain into wisdom and shadow into light. May this experience resonate in your heart like a beacon that never goes out, guiding your steps towards true freedom, the peace that comes from self-knowledge and unshakable self-love. Thank you for walking this far. May your journey be filled with discoveries, may your shadow be embraced with tenderness, and may yourself shine with all the strength of your deepest essence. Until next time, keep moving forward, confident and firm, because you are the transformation you've been searching for.